We've now got our form nicely showing off to the right-hand side of the screen. Let's continue working on the form and make sure that anytime someone enters in a number here and click on contribute, we actually call the contribute function on our campaign contract. Now the internals of this form is going to look nearly identical to the form that we've already put together to create a new campaign. So we're going to want to have our button show a spinner as soon as a user submits this thing. And as soon as the user submits it, we also want to call a function on our contract. So we're really going to be doing the same exact thing once again. So back inside my code editor, I'm going to find my contribute form. I think a good place to start will be to handle our input. So anytime the user enters some text into the input, we want to take that value and store it on our state object. Let's first get started by initializing our state object. So at the top, we'll do state. I'll set up a new property that I'll call value, and I'll set it empty or equal to an empty string. We'll then set up a couple of onChange handlers inside of the input, and we'll also set up our onSubmit on the form as well. So on the input, I'll give myself a little bit of space. I'll say that its value is going to come from this.state.value. And then anytime someone changes this thing, so onChange, we're going to call this arrow function that will just pass directly in. So we'll say event this.setState, value is event.target.value, like so. All right, so that looks pretty good. So next up, let's make our onSubmit handler for the actual form. So we're going to say that anytime someone submits this thing, let's call a function called this.onSubmit. And as a reminder, we're not going to place the parentheses on here because we don't want to call this at render time. We want to pass a reference to the function, so we can call it at some point in the future. Then let's make that function right away. So onSubmit. Remember, this will be called with an event object, and we need to call the prevent default function on that event object to keep the form from attempting to submit itself. All right, so now inside of onSubmit right here, we're going to do all the same exact logic that we were doing before on the last form. So we want to flip some loading flag over to true so we can show a button on or a spinner on our button. And then we're going to want to take our campaign contract and attempt to send some money to it. So let's start taking care of those steps in the next video. We're still inside of our contribute form component, specifically inside the onSubmit event handler. Eventually, we're going to add a function call to this thing to make sure that we call the contribute function on our campaign instance in order to send in some amount of money. Now, there's one thing to keep in mind here. At any time, we might have many different campaigns active. So whenever someone is contributing some money through the contribute form, we need to make sure that we specify exactly which campaign this person is attempting to donate money to. Right now, our campaign show component knows exactly what address the user is looking at on the screen, right? The address is in the URL, and we've already taken that address from the URL and gotten access to it inside of campaign show. And that's where we created our instance of a campaign and started pulling information off of it. So we now need to contribute that, or communicate that address down to our contribute form. So that the contribute form knows exactly which campaign it's trying to donate some money to. So we're going to take the address from this thing and pass it as a prop down to the contribute form. So then the contribute form has the address. That's pretty much it. So let's go back to our campaign show component. We're going to get that address and make sure we communicate it down. Back inside my code editor, I'm going to find the campaigns show.js file. So here's my campaign show component. You'll recall that inside of the getInitialProps function, we have access to the address on this query object right here. We're going to take this address and we're going to add it to the object that gets returned from getInitialProps, so that on our props object inside of our actual component instance, we'll have access to this.props.address. So on this object, I'll add on address, and that's going to come from props.query.address. And then don't forget to get a comma after it. Just to be clear here, the reason we're going through this step right here is that getInitialProps is not a part of our actual component instance. So even though getInitialProps knows about the campaign address, The rest of the methods inside this thing, which actually belong to the component instance, don't know about the address. So that's why we have to specifically return the address on this object right here. Okay, so now down inside of our component at the render method, we'll find our contribute form. Here it is. We're going to tell that contribute form the active address, or the address of the campaign that we are currently looking at on the screen. And that's going to come from this.props.address. And again, we have access to this variable right here because we just added it to that object that gets returned from getInitialProps. All right, so let's save this. I'm then going to close this file and go back to the contribute form. So now contribute form has access to this.props.address, right? So we now have access to the address inside of here. So now the last thing we have to do is make use of that campaign.js file that we made just a little bit ago. Remember, we created this function inside of here, and we had said if you pass an address into this thing, you'll get a setup contract that is ready to go and work with your campaign. So we're now going to import this function into our contribute form, and we'll pass our address into this function, and we'll get back our contract. So back inside of contribute form, at the top, I'm going to import campaign from up2 directories, or excuse me, up1 directory. We're currently inside of components. So up1 directory, we're going to go into Ethereum and then get that campaign file. Then inside of our onSubmit handler, we can say const campaign is capital campaign, and we'll pass in our address. All right, so now this is our actual contract instance, and it is definitely pointing at the correct address. Let's take a pause right here. We're going to come back to the next video, and we will be able to use this campaign instance to actually contribute some money over to our campaign. So quick break, and I'll see you in a minute. We've now got our campaign instance available inside of our onSubmit function. So all we have to do now is get a list of our accounts and call the contribute function on our campaign. Remember that anytime we want to call a function, we're going to wrap it in a try-catch statement to make sure that we handle any error message appropriately. So I'm going to place my try block and my catch block and make sure I receive that error argument to the catch. Then inside the try statement right here, we'll get a list of our accounts. Remember that we get a list of accounts from the Web3 module, and we have not yet imported that into this file. So at the top, I'm going to import Web3 from up1 directory, Ethereum, Web3, like so. Then back down inside of onSubmit, I'll say const accounts is await web3.eth.get accounts, like so. We're using the await keyword right here, so we do need to mark this function as being async. So make sure that right before the event argument, we place the async keyword right here. Then, after we get our list of accounts, we can take our campaign contract and call the contribute function on it. One quick reminder here, because we have not looked at that contract in a while. So here's the campaign contract right here. We've got the contribute function. It takes no arguments whatsoever, so we don't need to worry about providing any arguments. All right, so right after we get our list of accounts, we'll do await campaign.methods.contribute, and then we'll send in our transaction object. This is of course going to be a send because we're trying to send some money from one account to another. We'll first specify the account that we want to use. So that's going to be accounts at 0, and then we'll specify the value. Now we've recorded the value of the contribution inside of our this.state.value property, but there's one big gotcha here. Remember that we are marking our form as saying enter the amount of Ethereum or Ether that you want to contribute to the campaign. So this value property right here is going to be entered by our users in units of Ether. However, whenever we call send right here, we have to specify units of Wei. So we have to take our this.state.value property and convert that to Wei. And we can do so by using the Web3 module as usual. So I'll say web3.utils.toWei. I'll pass in this.state.value. And then we need to make sure that we mark the units that this argument right here is being provided in. So we are giving this .state.value in terms of Ether, and we want that to be converted over two-way. All right, so this is all we should really need to do a contribution to our campaign. So let's save this file, and I think we'll do a test right now, and we'll figure out whether or not this is behaving the way we expect. So I'm going to go back over to my browser, and I'm going to make sure that I do a hard refresh over here. Okay, so I'm going to refresh the page entirely. As I've mentioned many times, sometimes the hot module reload doesn't quite work the way we expect. Okay, so now one thing I want to mention about testing this contribution function right here, remember that you and I have a very limited supply of Ether to work with. So right now I'm down to 20.933. So when we start testing out this functionality, I don't really want to put in 1 Ether, right? Because I essentially have a limited amount to spend, even in testing. So whenever I start contributing to this contract, rather than specifying like 1 or 2 or 3, or definitely not 10, I'm going to do something like 0.001. So I can test this contract quite a bit without having to worry about running out of Ether. So I'll hit contribute now, and we should see our MetaMask confirmation appear. One thing to keep in mind is that you absolutely positively got to make sure that you are currently on your Rinkeby test network. And the other thing to keep in mind is that between our last test of MetaMask and now, your MetaMask account might have been locked. So do make sure that you pop up this little window right here, right? And make sure that you are not at this screen. So if you're at this screen, remember to unlock. All right, so I think that the fact that we see this notification appear over here is definitely a good sign. I'm going to try submitting this transaction, and then we'll just wait for a little bit, 15 seconds or whatever, and then we'll refresh this page and expect to see our campaign balance and our number of approvers increment as well. So let's take a pause right now. We'll come back in about 15 seconds and we'll make sure that these numbers eventually get updated. At the end of the last video, I made a contribution to this campaign. It's now been a couple of minutes since I did that contribution, but you'll notice that my little numbers down here reflecting the number of approvers and the campaign balance are still at 0. Let's try refreshing the page and just seeing what happens. So I'm going to refresh, wait just a second, and when I get this refresh on the screen, you'll notice that the number of approvers and the campaign balance has been updated to 1 and 0.001. So you might have been expecting to see these numbers automatically update after we submitted that contribution request, right? Well, unfortunately, that's not how things work. So just because we made a change to our contract, that's not going to automatically cause React to update the contract numbers that we see on the screen. To actually get these to update, we have to refresh our source of data, so to speak. I want you to remember really quickly that at present, we are pulling information off of our contract inside of the campaigns show.js file, specifically inside of the getInitialProps function. So this is where we access our campaign and call the getSummary function on it, and then return all that information for use inside of our component. So if we want to get all this information to update inside of our component, we have to somehow rerun the getInitialProps function. We have to run this thing again, get our list of props or our summary off the campaign, and then return that again and have the entire component to re-render. Now doing this inside of Next is kind of a little bit roundabout fashion. So to somehow kind of like refresh a component or get this entire function right here to rerun and then re-render the entire campaign show, what we're going to do is use our router object to just refresh the current route that we are looking at. You'll recall that we made use of the router object back when we were working on campaign new. So back on campaign new, after we had created a new campaign, we used our router to navigate to another route inside the application. We can use the router again, but rather than navigating to a different route, we can tell it to just refresh the current one that we are looking at. In other words, refresh campaigns looking at this particular address right here. And when we do that, the router will cause our getInitialProps function to rerun, refetch all of our campaign data, and show the same component on the screen, but with new data instead. So let's go back over to our our contribute form component. Here we are. We're going to import the router into this thing and then use the router to update the page to refetch all of that campaign data. All right, so at the top, we're going to import our router object. Router from, and then we are up one directory and we want to get it from the routes.js file. So /routes, lowercase routes like so. And then do remember we are using curly braces with this import because the routes file exports multiple different properties. And right now we only want the router. Now previously we had used a function on the router called pushRoute. When you call pushRoute, it creates a new entry in our browser's history. And that means that anytime a user presses the back button, there will be an additional address that they navigate back to. When we are refreshing a page, we don't want that behavior. We don't want the user to press the back button and then go back to the same URL that they are currently looking at. So to refresh our page, we're going to use a slightly different function. So down underneath our contribute call, inside of the onSubmit handler, we're going to call router.replaceRoute, like so. And then to replace the route, we're going to pass in the route that we want to replace the current one with. So this is going to be /campaigns/address. And actually that's this.props.address. All right, so a couple things going on here. First off, we are using an ES 2015 template string here. So make sure that you are using backticks, not single quotes and not double quotes. Next, we are passing in the URL of the current page that we are looking at. So this is what's going to cause the refresh of our current page. You'll recall that this.props.address is the address of the current campaign that we are looking at. So essentially we're just saying, hey, just refresh the page. And when that happens, we're going to rerun the getInitialProps function and update all the campaign data that we see. So let's now save this file and test this out inside the browser. All right, so I'll go back up to amount to contribute. I'm going to enter in 0.001 again, and I will attempt to contribute, and you know what, actually I just realized I didn't actually refresh the page. Let's make sure we do that hard refresh because I don't want this thing to fail the first time around. All right, so now we'll do 0.001. I'll contribute, and then I will submit. All right, so now we're just going to kind of sit and just wait for a little bit. This is about that 15 to 30 second wait where we are waiting for the transaction to be confirmed. After the transaction successfully goes through, we're probably not going to see a whole lot of change on this page. All we should really see is these numbers update. We might see a quick flash of content or something like that. And you know what? Okay, there we go. So now you'll notice that we have 2 approvers and we have a campaign balance of 0.002. So all we just did was refresh the current page, which caused our getInitialProps function to rerun, refetch information off our campaign, and display it on the screen. So hey, pretty elegant solution. Not a lot of difficulty for us. All right, so now anytime that a user contributes, we are properly updating the content on the screen. Now the last thing we have to do is a couple of the little extra features around our form, like handling error messages and putting a loading spinner on our button. So let's take care of both those very quickly in the next video. The last thing we have to do with our form is make sure we show a loading spinner whenever a user clicks on the button, and we also have to handle an error message if one occurs. We're going to take care of both these things very quickly in this video. We've already discussed both these systems in great detail with the last form we worked on, so we're just going to kind of throw the code down and get this portion complete. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is add 2 additional values to our state object. I'm going to add on error message as an empty string and loading as false. Next, whenever someone calls onSubmit, we're going to update that loading flag to true. So we'll say this.setState loading true. Then I'll find my catch statement down here. If an error occurs, we want to make sure that we take that error and we set it on our error message piece of state. So we'll say this.setState. Error message is going to come from error.message, like so. And then finally, after all this try catch block right here occurs, after all this happens, we're going to call setState one more time to turn our loading flag off no matter what. And we're also going to reset the value of the contribution amount as well at the same time, just to clear out the input on the form. So we'll say this.setState, loading is false, and value is empty string. So value right here is going to reset the form, and it's going to just clear out the number that we've placed inside there. And loading false is going to make sure that that button eventually stops spinning. So now that we've got these two pieces of state correctly taken care of, let's make sure that we actually hook them up inside of our render method. All right, so first we'll take care of our button. We need to make sure that we pass in the loading flag coming from this.state.loading. And that's pretty much all we have to do for loading. Now the error message is just a little bit more complicated. As a quick reminder, let's go back to our campaign new component and get a quick refresher on how we handled the error message over here. So if we scroll down a little bit, all right, so here's our message right here. We just placed the message component. We added the error property. We had the header, the content, and I think that was it. And then the other thing to keep in mind, and this was a real gotcha, was we needed to make sure that we marked the form component with that error property by using that double Boolean flip on the error message property. All right, so I'm going to make sure that we add this over as well. Let's take care of the form first. So here's the form. I'll add on error, and this is going to get exclamation, exclamation, this.state.error message. And then right above our button, we'll add on our message as well. And remember, this message is supposed to have error, header, and content. So message with error, header, and this can just be a string, and content, which will be this.state.error message, like so. Now just one last thing I want to check very quickly. Let's make sure that we did in fact add our import statement for message at the top of this file. So up at the top, I'm just going to confirm, yep, we did import message. So I think we're good in that regard. Okay, let's test out the spinner, and we're also going to test out the error handling as well. So I'm going to go back to my form. I'm going to refresh the page. And then for the first test here, I'm going to click on contribute. And it looks like it's throwing an error because we did not enter any amount in. So let's now add in 0.001. I'll contribute again. You'll notice we have the spinner properly. If I reject it now, the form gets reset. I see my error message and the spinner goes away. And then finally, if I add in 0.001 again and actually contribute this time, so I hit submit, we'll now wait for like those couple of seconds or so for this to actually be submitted. Now, one thing I'm already noticing right here is you'll notice that we are kind of forgetting to reset the error message state right here. So the user might be thinking that they are currently in an error, but in reality, we just didn't reset that state. So we can easily take care of that back inside of our onSubmit handler. We're just going to make sure that anytime a user attempts to resubmit the form, we clear out the existing value of error message. So when we set loading to true, we'll also reset error message to be an empty string. Okay, so it looks like that just went through. I've now got my incremented number of approvers, and I've got my campaign balance as well. So I think this form is working out pretty well. Let's take a pause right here and continue in the next section. The last thing we have to do on our campaign show component is make sure that there's a link at the very bottom that the user can click to look at all the outstanding requests that have been created for this particular campaign. Remember that we already discussed the structure of the link for this new page. We had said that a user should be able to see a list of all those requests if they go to campaigns, the address, and then requests. So let's put a new button into our campaign show component that will take a user to that URL. Here's our campaign show component. At the very top, I'm going to import the link tag that we have already worked with once before from our root routes.js file. So at the very top, I will import link from up two directories, routes, like so. We also want to show a button for this link. So let's also import button from Semantic UI React as well. All right, so now we can go down to the bottom of this file and find our render method. Inside of there, I'll find the column that is currently being used to display our render cards function. So here's render cards right here. So right underneath that list of cards, we want to show our link. So I'm going to make sure that I put this new button inside of this column. So right underneath this thing, I'll put on a new link. Remember that whenever we define a link, we have to specify the route that clicking on it will take our user to. So I'm going to specify a route with a ES2015 template string. Remember backticks. We'll do campaigns slash this.props.address. That's the address of the current contract we are looking at, slash requests, like so. And then inside of here, we'll place an anchor tag and a button inside that. I'll give it the primary attribute so that it appears nice and blue, just like all of our other buttons. And I'll give this a text view requests, like so. All right, so I definitely am thinking that this link is going to work correctly. I definitely suspect we're going to get the link to show up on the page, and if we click it, we'll go to this URL. The only problem is that we have not yet actually defined this URL inside of our application. So we need to open up our routes.js file and define a new route inside that, and then create an appropriate component inside of our pages directory to show that list of requests. So inside of my pages directory, I'm going to find the campaigns folder. Now, you might be thinking, all right, we have campaigns, here's how we make a new one, and here's how we show one. So you might be thinking that we're going to create a separate directory also inside of pages called requests. And then we'll put our component to show all the requests and create a new one inside that folder. But we're going to actually create that request folder inside of campaigns so that we more closely follow the pages structure of a Next.js application, where usually the names of our folders are used to determine the actual URL or the route that we're trying to visit. So all I'm saying is that we're going to put this new request folder inside of the campaigns directory rather than the pages one. So inside of campaigns, I'm going to make a new folder called requests. And then inside of requests, we're going to eventually create two separate components. One is going to be used to show a list of all of our requests, and the other will be used to show a form to make a new one. So inside this request directory, I'm going to first make an index.js file. So index.js seems to is being used here to indicate that this is going to show a list of requests to the user. Then inside of here, we'll make a class-based component and just put a little bit of dummy JSX on the screen so we can at least make sure that this request route is working. So I will import React and component from React, and I'll make a new request index page that's going to extend component. We'll set up our render method. From inside there, we will return. How about just an H1? Actually, what? That's crazy. Let's do an H3. H1's too big. We'll say request list. And then finally at the bottom, we will export default request index, like so. All right, let's now go back to our routes.js file and make sure that we set up a dynamic route to watch for anything that looks like campaigns slash an address slash requests. So back inside of routes.js, I'm going to make sure that I remove the semicolon at the end of the current last .add statement. And we're going to chain on one more .add. So this one is going to be slash campaigns slash address slash requests. And if anyone goes to this path or this link right here inside of our application, we want to show them the component that is located at campaigns requests index. So campaigns requests, and then finally index, like so. And I'll show you that entire line. Just make sure it's all, let me zoom out just for a second, just to make sure it's all legible. All right, so there we go. So let's now test out this new button and this new component that we just created inside of our browser. So I'm going to go back over to my application. I'm going to first do a hard refresh here to make sure that all those new routes get loaded up. Now you'll notice right away that we appear to have no margin between the button and the card right above it. So we got a little bit of a styling issue. We'll come back to that in just a second, but first let's click on this link and make sure that it actually works. So if I click on the link right here, it eventually shows me the text request list. Cool, so I think that's working out the way we expect. Now let's take a quick pause right now. We'll come back to the next video and we'll make sure that we've got a little bit of margin between this last card and the button that's right there. We've got our view request button visible on the screen, but there's just a little bit of a styling issue here. where it appears that the button is sandwiched up way too closely to the card right above it. If we go back to the semantic UI documentation and look up the grid section again, we can scroll down to the content section in here and eventually find a short little article about rows. So the purpose of a row in the context of a layout is to make sure that there is some discernible space between every grouping of content. So in this little diagram right here, these two little boxes that you see form one row that spans from the left to the right. They then create a second row underneath that has another three boxes right here. When we place a row, we automatically get some amount of space placed between each row. So if we take a look at the markup that they actually use, they place a grid. They then place two separate rows inside that. So here's row number 1 and row number 2. And then they place an arrangement of columns inside of each of those. So if we go back to our campaign show component and add in this concept of a row, this whole spacing issue will be automatically taken care of for us. So let's do that really quickly. All right, so here is the render method of my campaign show component. So I'm inside the pages, campaigns, show.js file right now. Here's the grid, and then we've got column 1 and column 2. So we want these two columns right here, the list of cards, the list of cards right here, and the form to appear in their own row. So they should be right next to each other. So I'm going to wrap both these columns inside of a grid.row. So here's grid.row. Then underneath the bottom column, so here's the second column right here, I'm going to close that tag off. And then I'm going to indent both those columns in. Now we're going to create a second row, and the only purpose of this second row is going to be to contain the button that we just created. By making this second row, it's going to give us some visible standoff or separation between the two. So after we close off that row, I'll then create a second one, grid.row, and close off grid.row. So then inside of this second row right here, I'm going to go back and find my link tag, the anchor tag, and the button that we just added in the last video. I'll then cut all this and put it into that second row. Now I'll save this file and we'll go check out the result in the browser. And very quickly you'll notice, yep, it sure looks like we got the right thing. However, there's just one last thing to be aware of here. You'll notice that the button is a little bit out of bounds. So it's a little bit farther off to the left-hand side. So whenever we use a row like this, we have to wrap elements inside of it in at least one column. So we have got a row right here. Inside the row, we must place a column, and then we can place our actual content inside of that. So I'm going to make sure that I just wrap my link tag with a grid.column. Now this one doesn't need a set width specified because there's no other competing columns that are also going to be placed inside this row. All right, so let's save this. And now back over, everything is nicely lined up. Okay, so I think this component or this page right here is all good to go. And I think we're now ready to move on in earnest on the request list page. So let's continue with that component in the next video. We've now got a place to print out all the open requests that are tied to a very specific campaign. And remember, the campaign that they are tied to will have its address inside the URL. Let's go take a look at our mockup again, just to get a sense of what this page is supposed to look like. All right, so of course we want to have our header at the very top. We then want to have a table that lists out all the different requests that have been created for this campaign. And of course, we want to have a button that a user can use to go over to a form to make a new request as well. Now we could certainly start working on this table right now, but we don't have any requests tied to our current campaign. So I think that step number 1 is going to be to add in this add request button, go make the form to add a request, and then once we can actually make a request, then we can come back over and create this table. Of course, we could go use Remix to make a request manually, but hey, I think that maybe it'd be best if we try to use our own form to modify these requests. Then we could very easily have an idea of whether or not the form is behaving the way we expect. So let's get started by placing our layout component inside of this request index page that will get our header to show up. And then we'll also add in the button to link a user over to a form to create a new request. All right, so I'm going to flip back over to my code editor where I've still got my request index component open. At the top, we're going to add in an import statement to get our layout.js component. So we'll add import layout from, and now here's where things are going to get a little bit nasty. Notice how we are now 3 directories nested. So we have to go up 3 directories and then go into components. So that would be ... / 2, 3, and then components layout, like so. Now, I don't know about you, but these relative file references have been getting really annoying throughout this entire application that we've been working on, right? Having to like spell out all these dots really doesn't seem like a good use of time. Later on, after we finish the bulk of this application, I'm going to show you how you can kind of tweak our Webpack configuration just a little bit to avoid having to specify all these extra dots right here. But that's something that's really not closely related to Ethereum at all. So I didn't do that right away at the very start in case you are wanting to focus on the Ethereum side. But we will come back at the end and take a look at how we can address this relative route stuff. All right, so that will give us our layout component. So then inside of request index, I'm going to replace that h3 with our layout. And you know what? Let's actually put the h3 in there. Why not? So we'll leave the h3 in. We'll say open, how about not even open, we'll just say requests, like so. Okay, so now if we go back over, okay, that's looking good. Let's now import our button tag and our routes helper and place a link in here to get our user over to that new route that we still need to create. So at the top of this file, let's import our button from semantic UI React, and then we'll also import the link helper from up to routes. And notice again, this is 3 double dots right here. So now right underneath our H3, we can place a link tag that contains an anchor and our button. And so this is going to be the button that a user clicks to go to the page to create a brand new request. So we'll do a link tag. We'll put our anchor inside there. And then inside there, we'll do our button. As before, we'll give the button a prop of primary. And we'll give it the text add request. And then we also need to specify the route on the link tag right here. Let's go look at that chart that tells us all the different URLs that we're going to have in our application really quick. All right, so back over at our diagram, right around here. Okay, so to create a new request, the user should be going to a route of campaigns, the address, requests, /new. Now we don't yet have our actual address available inside of this component, right? We've definitely discussed how we could get access to it inside of the get initial props function, but we haven't defined that function inside of here just yet. So let's define that function, get our address out of the URL, and then pass it into our component as props. So at the top, we'll say static async get initial props. We'll receive that initial props object. We're going to pull the address out of it. So we'll say const, and we'll do a little bit of destructuring this time, which I don't think we did previously. So we'll get our address from props.query, and then we can return an object with address. And then of course, since the key and value here are the same, we can shorten this up with a little bit of ES 2015 syntax to be simply address. So now for our link tag right here, we can use an ES6 template string again. So we got a backtick right here. This will take us to campaigns, this.props.address /requests/new, like so. Now, of course, before we actually test this out, we have to create that new route and make a new component, just like we did for this request index component as well. So let's make the new component first. Inside of my pages directory, I'm going to make a new file called new.js. So this will show the new form that is related to requests. Inside of here, we'll put down some more familiar React boilerplate. So import React and component from React, We'll do a class of request new. That'll extend our base class of component. We'll add in our render method and return again in H3 that says create a request. And then at the bottom, we'll export default request new. All right, very last thing, let's add in a route for this one as well. So here's my root routes.js file. Before we add on this new route, I want to remind you that the order in which we add routes here is the order in which they will be parsed. So it doesn't really matter in this case whether or not we add the next route above or below the current one. Remember that previously we kind of ran into an issue, right, where we were trying to show the campaign/new component or route right here, and that was accidentally getting picked up by this rule. So all I mean to say is that with this new route that we're adding in, we don't have to worry about that because the end of this new route is going to end in /new. So there won't be any kind of collisions or anything. I'm going to make sure I clean up the semicolon at the end of the line above it, and then I'll add in one more rule. So this will be campaigns, address, requests, new. And whenever someone goes here, we want to take them to the component at campaigns, requests, new, like so. All right, I think we're ready for a test. So we'll go back over to the browser. I'm going to make sure I refresh this page. Now we get a little 404 here. I might have made a little typo. Let's see what our error message is. Okay, page does not exist. So that's an interesting one. Let's go back over to our routes file. You know what? Everything over here looks fine to me. Yeah, it looks fine. Let's try a refresh again. Huh. Okay, well, let's pause right here. We'll come back in the next video and we'll figure out exactly what just went wrong. At the end of the last video, we got a nasty 404 error message. That was due to a little oversight on my part. We changed our routes file, and whenever we do that, we have to restart our server. Otherwise, the server is not aware of these new routes that we are defining. The reason that I didn't immediately catch that is that it's kind of interesting. When we get to the client side, that routes file is read successfully and automatically refreshed. So if we navigate around our application, like by clicking on links and whatnot, the changes to the routes file will be reflected inside the application. However, it's when we refresh the application that those routes are not actually used by the server. So it works on the client, but not on the server. So to solve that issue, all we have to do is restart our server. So at the command line, you can stop the server with Control-C, and we'll start it right back up with npm run dev. All right, so we'll give it just a second to boot back up. As usual, we should see that compiled successfully message, and then we can refresh while looking at the request route. And after a little bit of boot up time, we'll eventually see our component appear back on the screen. Yeah, there we go. So now I can click on add request, and we go over to the request/new route. And now I can refresh this thing and the same page will appear. Very good. All right, so now that we have this route in place, we can start thinking about the actual content of this page. Now this is going to be yet another form that we're going to be building. So this is form number 3. So we've gone through this process twice already, and this form is going to be completely identical to the other two. So this time we're going to speed through this form rather quickly because I imagine that you've probably had your fill of forms at this point. So let's go work on our request new component, and we're going to put this thing together in record time. All right, so I'm going to flip back over to my code editor, and I'm going to open up my request new file. Now we're going to need a couple of different things inside of here. We're definitely going to need React Semantic UI. I think we're probably going to need our campaign contract, and I think we're probably going to eventually end up needing our Web3 instance as well. So let's do a couple of imports at the top. I'm going to start off by importing form, button, and message from Semantic UI React. I'm going to import our campaign function from, and this is going to be a doozy for importing in. So we're going to go up 3 directories into Ethereum and then get campaign. So up, 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 Ethereum, campaign. And we'll get our Web3 instance at the same time as well. So import Web3 from to 3, Web3. Okay, that looks good. The other thing I think we're probably going to need is our link helper and our router from our routes file. Because remember, after we successfully create this new request, we probably want to automatically navigate our user back to the list of routes that they were just looking at. So I'm going to also import link and router from up routes. Okay, so I think that should do it for now. We can now put all these different libraries to use inside this component. All right, so just as we did before, we're going to need access to the address that the user is currently looking at inside the URL inside this component. So let's define our static async get initial props function to pull off that address and return it as a prop for our component. So I'll say const address is simply props.query, and then I will return address, like so. Then we can start putting together some of the different markup inside of our render method. So this is going to be where we actually create our form. So I'm going to return our form. And then inside this thing, we're going to have 3 separate form fields. So the first one will be to add a description for the request, then the value in Ether, and a recipient as an address. So I'm going to place a form.field. We'll do a label inside of here. The first one is going to be a description. And then you know what? Just to save a little bit of time, I'm going to copy paste this down twice more for the other 2 fields that we need. So 1 and 2. And then I'll fix up that indentation. The second field that we're going to create is going to be the value. And that is supposed to be in Ether, is what we are reflecting here. So let's do the same. So value in Ether. And then finally the description. Or not the description, but the recipient address. So we'll mark that as simply recipient, like so. Now for the inputs, we want to use our input element from Semantic UI React again. Let's make sure that we import that at the top because I think we missed it during the initial go through. So yeah, we actually did. So I'm going to add on input from Semantic UI React at the top. So now we can add in an input to each of these field elements. So I'll do input and input and one more input as well. Now each of these inputs right here needs to get some initial state initialized, and then we have to set up event handlers on all 3. So that's going to be a little bit of typing. We might as well start right now. Let's first initialize our state object above our get initial props. So I'll say state equals, and then we'll give this thing value of empty string, description of empty string, and then finally recipient as empty string. Now we can make use of these on all 3 inputs. So we'll do each one at a time. So the first one is our description. So we'll set up its value as this.state.description. And we can set up our onChange handler. So onChange event this.setState description is going to be event.target.value. I'm going to save this right now just so that it'll reformat so you can see everything nicely on one line. All right, there we go. So now we can repeat that same process for the other 2 inputs as well. So we'll do value is this.state.value. We'll do an onChange of event this.setState. Value is event.target.value. And I'll save it again, and I don't think it's going to do any reformatting this time. Okay, just one more. So we want to do our last input here for the recipient. Its value is going to be this.state.recipient. We'll do an onChange with event this.setState value, or not value this time, excuse me. This is going to be our recipient. Will be event.target.value. Okay, so we just did a tremendous amount of typing there. I do highly encourage you to check some of your typing on all these inputs. So make sure that on all three of them, we are passing in a prop of value and on change. And then we should see description, description. We should see value, updating value. And we should see recipient, updating recipient, like so. Real easy to make a typo here, so do triple check on that. All right, so now that we've got those form fields down, we can now create our button at the bottom. So we'll make my button, which is going to be a capital button because we're using the button component coming from React Semantic UI, or Semantic UI React, excuse me. I don't think the order in that name really makes a difference, right? We'll give this button a name of create, and I'll mark it as primary for its styling. Okay, I think this is a good start. Let's flip back over to our browser and see how it's going. So back inside the browser, yes, we got our form showing up. Now the layout component obviously has not yet been required in because we have absolutely no styling on this thing just yet. So let's make sure that we also import the layout and display that inside the render method as well. So up at the top, I'm going to add in yet another import statement. I'll get layout from 1, 2, 3 components, layout, and then I'll place this thing inside of our render method. So down inside of render, right here, right above the form, I'll put layout, and I'm going to indent the entire form just to get my format or my indentation correct, and I'll close off the layout as the bottom tag, like so. So now if I go back over, yeah, there we go. Much better styling than what we had before. Now the form definitely looks appropriate. However, it's kind of unclear to our users what they're doing here, right? Like there's no title on this form or anything like that. So maybe we should very quickly add on a title so that it's a little bit more clear what you're doing here. So back up right above a form. So right above it, I'm going to just add on a quick H3, and I'm going to give that the text of create a request, like so. Okay, that's a little bit more evident. Okay, I think that this form has the correct markup. Now it's just going to be up to us to add on a couple of event handlers to handle submission. So let's take care of that all in one go in the next video. In the last video, we added a tremendous amount of markup to our request new component. Let's now continue with this component by wiring up our onSubmit event handler right here. So just like our previous onSubmit handlers, this one is going to look very similar. We're going to first get a reference to our campaign instance by using our address. We'll then set up a try catch. We'll call a function on the campaign, and hopefully it all goes through. So let's first get started by getting access to our campaign instance. We've already set up the get initial props function right here that takes the address out of the URL and returns it as a prop to be used inside of our component. We've also already imported our campaign function at the very top. So we can use those two things to get access to our campaign instance. So I'll say inside of our onSubmit handler, const campaign is going to be capital C campaign, and we're going to pass in this .props.address, like so. Now when we use this campaign right here to eventually call the create request function, we're going to want to pass in our description, the value, and the recipient address. And we've been recording all those three properties on our state object. So let's destructure those properties off right up here before we need them, just to keep our code a little bit more concise. So right after we create our campaign, we'll do const description, value, and recipient from this .state. Then right after that, we can place our try catch statement. So we'll do try, we'll place our catch, and we'll receive the error object if one occurs. Then inside the try, we'll do the same thing as before. We'll get our list of accounts and then use the account at 0 to send in a request to our create request function. So we'll do const accounts equals await web3.eth.get accounts. We'll then do await campaign.methods.create request. Now when we call create request right here, we have to pass in the three arguments, description, value, and recipient. But remember, when these arguments get passed into our actual Solidity function, they have to be passed in the correct order. So let's very quickly open up our contract file and just verify the order in which we're supposed to pass these things in. So inside my Ethereum contracts campaign.sol file, I'll find the create request function. Here it is right here. You might have to scroll down a little bit. Remember, it's like halfway down the file. So here's create request. The expectation here is that we're going to pass in first our description, then the value, and then the address. So that's the order in which we pass these in. One other thing that I want to point out is that we've been assuming that value right here would be passed in as a way value. So we expect this to be way as opposed to ether. And we can actually just verify that very quickly by looking down at finalize request. So finalize request right here, eventually we call the transfer method and we pass in request.value. So we're not doing any change of units here from way over to ether or anything like that. So we need to make sure that when we pass in the amount of ether or way that we want to tie to this request, it has to be in units of way. All right, so back over inside of our onSubmit function, here's create request. We're going to first pass in description, and then we need to pass in value. But value right here, remember, inside of our form, we mark the form as saying like value in ether. We're expecting our users to type a ether value in here. So we're going to use Web3 to convert value over to way, just as we did a moment ago. For this, I'm going to give myself just a little bit of space here. So I'm going to do some new lines. And then I'll do web3.utils.toWay. We'll take our value and convert it from ether to way. All right, and then finally, we're going to take our recipient address and pass that in as the third argument. Now the very last step is to chain on our .send and say who is sending this request in. So this is going to be from accounts at 0, like so. All right, I'm going to save the file. When I do, you're going to see my code jump a little bit. Again, that's my formatter in action. Before we test this out in the browser, we have to make sure that we wire up the onSubmit function right here to our actual form. So that's the one thing that we have not yet taken care of. So if I go down to my form component right here, we need to make sure that we define the onSubmit handler, and we tell this thing to call this.onSubmit whenever someone submits the form. All right, so now we're ready to test this thing out. I'm going to flip back over to my browser. I'm going to do a hard refresh of this entire page. There we go. Now, one thing that I have people very frequently ask me about is this little icon that I have right here. This little icon is very particular to my browser. I'm running a password manager that tries to automatically deal with forms on the screen, and that's why I have this icon right here. But you probably will not have that icon unless you use the same password manager. The other thing I want to mention is that you'll see down here we've got a warning now about extra attributes. We'll deal with this in just a little bit, but for right now, let's just focus on the form. So as we fill out the form, we'll put in a description first. We'll say something like, I don't know, buy battery casings. That's going to be the description of my first spending request. I'm also going to zoom this in so you can see my text a little bit more easily. Next, I'll specify my value in ether. Remember, at this point, we can only try to send off an amount of ether less than our contract balance. Now, there's no limitation on creating requests with 999 ether. We can definitely create requests, but if we ever want to actually finalize this request, we won't be able to source 9,999 ether. So I know that my contract right now has about 0.003 ether because that's how many times I've contributed to it. So I'm going to just try to request out of it 0.001 ether. That's all I'm going to try to deal with here. And then the last thing to keep in mind is that the recipient right here must be a valid address. So we can't just put gibberish in here. It's got to be a real address. Obviously, we're going to probably want to verify that someone successfully gets sent some money here. So to make sure that I'm working with a real address that can receive some amount of money, I'm going to go back up to MetaMask and I'm going to attempt to create a second account. Now, chances are you might have already clicked on this create account button once. So if you already have another account in here labeled as account 2, just go ahead and swap over to that one. Otherwise, if you only have one account like me, you can click on Create Account. Now, when we create this account, remember how we had previously said that MetaMask is generating these accounts. They're all tied to our single 12-word mnemonic. So this is not really truly creating a completely new and separate account. It's still somewhat kind of tied to our first one. Anyways, the point here is all we really need to do is get access to this address and enter in this other recipient, or this recipient entry right here with this address. So then when we eventually approve and finalize this request, we can actually receive money on this other account right here, and we can just verify it inside of our transaction history. So I'm going to click the ... I'm going to copy address to clipboard, and then I'll paste it in as the recipient, like so. All right, so now the moment of truth. We're going to click on Create, and we should see our MetaMask notification here pop up. Now, here's one thing that's interesting. You'll notice that we have a message on here that says insufficient balance. So what's this mean? Well, it means that I'm still selecting account number 2 as being the source for this transaction. But account number 2 for me right now has not enough money to actually cover the transaction. So that's why I'm seeing this warning message here on the screen. So I think that we probably need to go back over to account number 1 where we actually have some Ether available and use that to source the transaction. So I'm going to reject this one. I'm going to go back over to MetaMask. I'm going to use the little selecty thing right here to go back over to account number 1. And then I'll click on Create again. Okay, so now we're using the correct account to create this transaction. I'm using account number 1, and that is the account with all my money tied to it. So I'm now going to submit this, and we could pretty much just wait. Remember that right now, we have absolutely nothing inside of our application to really verify whether or not this request is being created successfully. So I think that at this point, we need to add in a couple of last little finishing touches around this form, and then immediately start working on our component that's going to list out all the different requests that have been created. Then we'll be able to actually verify that this request was made successfully. Okay, so let's pause right here. We're going to do a couple last finishing touches on this form in the next video, and then continue on to our request list component. At the end of the last video, I had mentioned that we don't really have the ability to verify that the request was created easily. However, I realized that's not entirely true. If we actually go back to our campaign show page and look up the current campaign that we're looking at right now, we should see that our number of requests has been incremented to 1. So if I go back to our root page by clicking on the logo here at the top, I can then see the current campaign that we're working with. I'll view that campaign. And then once I'm looking at this thing, I should see that I have 1 pending request now. So 1 pending request means that our request was just successfully created. So I think it's working out correctly. All right, let's go back to our request list page. Here's the request list, and I want to go back to the form that we were just working on. In this video, we're going to add on some additional elements to this form just to make sure that it works like our other ones. So in particular, we're going to add on the error message handler and our button spinner. At this point, this is going to be the 3rd time in a very short time frame that we have been working on this error message in the spinner. So I just want you to know, if you don't care about working on this form anymore, you can absolutely just skip this video and go on to the next section, where we're going to start working on getting our list of requests to print on the screen. So again, if you don't care about doing this extra stuff for the form, then just continue on. Okay, so if you're still here, I'm going to assume that you want to finish up this form with me. So let's flip back over to our code editor, and we're going to put the rest of this thing together. I'm inside my request new component. We've already imported the message component right here, and we've already placed our button. And those are the 2 big things that we need to be aware of, because we're really focused around placing the spinner on the button and our error message. Okay, so let's first start off by adding on our 2 extra properties to our state object. We'll set up loading as false, and we'll also set up our error message as an empty string. We'll first take care of our spinner on the button. So we'll go down to our render method. I'm going to find my button, and just as before, we're going to specify the loading prop as coming from this .state.loading. Then inside the onSubmit handler, we'll update our set state calls. So here's our onSubmit. as soon as we enter this method right here, I'm going to immediately attempt to update this .setState. We're going to do loading to true. And I'm also going to reset the error message if one has already been set on this component. So I'll set error message to be empty string, just to clear the existing error message off of there. Then inside of our catch statement, we'll take that error message and set it back on. So we'll do this .setState. We'll take our error message from error.message, and we'll also flip that loading flag to false. And you know what? Actually, we don't have to do that here. We should do that outside, so we only have to do it one time. That would be for the best. So I think inside of here, yeah, we just really want to do that error message. So then outside, we can do this .setState, loading over to false. Now, one last thing that we need to be aware of here before we go take care of the error message down inside of our render function, we need to make sure that after we successfully create a new request, we want to navigate our users back to the list of all requests. So we've already imported our router helper from routes right here. So let's make use of that router helper. Immediately after we successfully create the request, we'll do a router.pushRoute. And then we're going to do backticks. Again, don't forget backticks here. Real easy thing to miss. And we'll take our user back to campaigns, this .props.address/requests. So they can go back to that page and look at the new request that has been created. All right, I think that's it for our form handler. Let's now go back down to the render method and we'll set up the error message handling. So let's make sure that we add our error property to the form. So we'll say error is going to be exclamation, exclamation, this .state.error message. And we'll set up the message component itself as well. So right above our button, here we go. We'll place our message. And I always forget the names of the properties that go on this thing. All right, we want error. We want the header of oops, and then the content of this .state.error message. And we'll close off the message tag. Okay, I think this is good. Let's flip back over to the browser and do a quick test. So back over here, I'll do a hard refresh of the page. I'll then immediately click on the create button. When I do that, we get an error message. That's good. And then if I do a description of something, a value in ether, let's do 0.001 again, and a recipient of, it doesn't matter. Let's just see some error messages here. I can then click on create. You'll immediately notice that, okay, provided address is not valid. That's good. Let's get a valid address. So I'll go up to MetaMask, and I'm just going to copy the current account that I have selected. So this is my account 1, and I'll paste that in as the recipient. So now if I create, you'll notice that error message goes away. I get my spinner successfully, and now if I click on reject, I get my error message here again. Okay, so I think this looks pretty good. Now there is one last tiny little thing that I would really like to have. I would really like to have a link at the very top maybe to navigate our users back to the list of requests. So let's add that in very quick as well. So right above our H3 at the top, here's our H3. I'm going to add in a link tag. And remember, we've already imported this thing once already. We imported this at the top when we got our router helper as well. I'm going to put an anchor in here. I'll put in a button. I'll mark it as primary. And I'll just give it the text back. And I'll make sure that I set up a route on the link tag itself to take the user back to campaigns, this .props.address requests, like so. All right, so let's save this and test this out. Last piece. So back inside the browser, we get the button there, and you know what? That is darn ugly. I think a button at the top really is not going to cut it. So let's just remove the button. Let's just make it a clickable link. So I'm just going to take this entire button right here. I'll just replace it with the text back. So now we'll have a simple anchor tag. Yeah, okay, that's much more reasonable. So now we can click on back right here, and it will take us back to our list of requests. And of course, we can click on add request, back, add request, back. Okay, cool. So I think that we've now wrapped up our form with a little bit of extra polish. So let's take a break, and we're going to start working on our last big component, which is our request index page, in the next video. We're just about ready to start working on our request index component, but before we do, we need to make sure that we have at least one request tied to our current campaign. So I'm going to use the form that we just made to make one new request and submit it as a transaction. I'm going to go back to the add request page. I'm going to create a request with a description of buy some battery casings. I'm going to request a value in Ether of 1 Ether. And then for the recipient, I'm going to enter in a valid address here. And I'm going to provide an address for my account number 2 that is tied to my account. So here's account number 2. I'll do copy address from clipboard, and then I will mark that person as the recipient. Now, before I click create, I am going to make sure that I toggle back over to account number 1. So here's account number 1, and now I can go ahead and click on create. I get my MetaMask notification. It's specifying account number 1, and I'll go ahead and submit it. Okay, so that should be it. Let's take a break right now, and then we'll come back in the next video and start putting together our request index component. We're now ready to start working on our last component, which is the request index component. Let's do a quick review of a mock-up just to make sure that we're on the same page. All right, here we go. At the top right-hand side of the screen, we should have a button that allows the user to create a new request. Now we've already got that button, so I think we're pretty good in that regard. At the bottom left, we want to have a counter that displays the number of requests that have been created. And then finally, right in the center, we want to have a big table that lists out all the different requests that have been created for a single campaign. Now, unfortunately, making this table is going to be a little bit more challenging than you might think. And let me tell you exactly why. The first thing that we're probably going to want to do here is fetch all the different requests that have been created for a campaign, right? Like that makes a ton of sense. We're trying to make a table that lists out all of our requests, so let's go and fetch all of our requests. Well, that's exactly where the problem lies. You see, with Solidity, we do not currently have support, and this might be a little bit surprising, we do not have support right now for returning arrays of structs. And that's exactly what this table is supposed to show. We have one request struct for every single request that has been created inside of our campaign. So we definitely want to get that entire big list, and ideally we would do it all in one go, one call over to our campaign. But Solidity just does not have support for that just yet. We cannot return an array of structs. And just in case you don't believe me, I've taken the liberty of writing out a function that would, in theory, do exactly what you and I want. So I added this function called getAllRequests to our campaign contract. It should be returning an array of type request right here. And then you can see that the logic inside of it says simply return requests, just return every request I have. But you'll notice that I get an error message over here. And the error message says that we are not allowed to return internal or recursive types. And that's what we have here. We have a recursive user-defined type. So we have an array that contains a struct. That is a recursive type. It's some array that contains another type inside of it. So that's what this thing is complaining about right here. So unfortunately, we cannot write a function like this. You will recall, however, that a couple of videos ago, we made this getRequestCount function instead. And this getRequestCount function returned the length or the number of requests that were tied to a given campaign. So although we cannot get all of our requests in one single go or one single call to this campaign that we've deployed, we can instead request the total number of requests or ask for the total number of requests that have been created and then retrieve all of them one by one. Now obviously this is not ideal at all. And it'd be a lot more ideal if we could figure out some other way to get all of our requests in one go. But for right now, this is the best case scenario we have. This is the best workaround. So we're going to call getRequestCount. That will tell us how many requests have been created. And then we will do some type of looping logic inside of our component to request each of those one by one. So that's going to be the plan. Let's take a pause right now. We'll come back in the next video and we're going to start to implement that logic inside of our component. In the last section, we spoke about how we cannot fetch all of our requests in one single function call. So instead, inside of our request index component, I'm going to find my getInitialProps function. And inside of here, we're going to first get our total number of requests from our campaign, and then we're going to attempt to fetch each of them one by one. Again, not super ideal, not the best approach in the world, but it's essentially what we have to do for right now. So with that in mind, let's first get started by getting a hold of our campaign contract inside this getInitialProps function. Once we do, we'll get our total number of requests, and then we'll work from there. So the first thing I think we need to do is import in our campaign contract, or the campaign function in this case, from our Ethereum campaign.js file. So up at the top, I will import campaign from up 3 directories, Ethereum campaign, like so. Then inside of our getInitialProps function, we'll get a handle on our campaign instance by creating a new variable called campaign, calling the campaign function, and we'll pass our address into that, like so. Next, we can use this instance right here to get the total number of requests that have been created. As we just saw a moment ago inside of Remix, we have that getRequestCount function that we can make use of. So we're going to issue a call to getRequestCount. So back over here, we'll say const request count is await campaign.methods.getRequest. And let me check the getRequest. So notice how over here we put an S on this, getRequestCount. So let's make sure that we stay consistent over here. So getRequestCount.call, like so. All right, so now here comes a little bit more of the fun logic. So I'd said that we can essentially, for however many times, for request count right here, we can somehow iterate or loop through and fetch every individual request. Now, rather than looping through per se and making these requests or these calls over to our campaign instance one by one, we're going to issue all the calls in one go, and then we'll wait for them all to be resolved by using the promise.all helper. Now to do this is going to require a little bit of fancy JavaScript here. All right, so we're going to use a little fancy JavaScript. As usual, we're going to write out our code and we'll talk about exactly what it does. So I'm going to say const requests equals await promise.all, and then inside of a set of parentheses here, we're going to say array request count dot fill dot map, and we're going to place an arrow function inside this map. So I'm going to say element and index, and then I'm going to open up the arrow function like so, and we'll say return campaign dot methods dot requests index dot call, like so. All right, so we'll talk about exactly what this whole block of code right here does in just a second, but before we do, let's attempt to console log out this request thing. I just want to console log it and see what happens. All right, so I'm going to console log requests, I'm going to save the file, and we'll go back over to the browser and we're going to refresh the page. All right, so back over here, I'll refresh the page. Now it might take a second, yeah, there we go. Now remember, anytime that we do a console log at our getInitialProps function and then refresh the entire page, the initial console log is not going to appear inside of our browser or console. Instead, it's going to appear in our terminal window where we are running our server. So I'm going to flip back over to my server. Here it is right here. And if I zoom out, I should see a console log of all the different requests that I've created tied to this particular campaign. So in this case, I see one request right here because at this point, I've created simply one request. My request says buy battery casings. Here's the amount of money that I'm asking for. I've got the recipient, whether or not it has been finalized, and the number of approvals as well. Now this definitely looks like a struct right here, and we've definitely worked with structs before. So not only do we get this kind of array accessor into the request, but we also have the different field properties labeled on here as well. So it definitely looks like I'm getting back a list of requests here, but that doesn't really answer what's going on with the code that you and I just wrote. So let's flip back over and kind of take this apart. I think that the challenging part here to understand is the array with request count dot fill right here. So the thing to keep in mind is that our request method right here will retrieve a given individual request. So like a request at index of 0 or index of 1 or index of 2. Because remember, we are using an array to store all these different requests. So index right here, what we really want is to iterate from 0 all the way up to request count. That's how we kind of want to iterate through this thing. Now to do that, I use this array.fill thing right here. And that's just a little bit of a trick. So let's flip over to our terminal and I'll show you exactly what that array fill does. So let's imagine that we have one request right now, maybe just like one request total. So I could say array, I could pass in that one request total and then dot fill like so. So that returns to me an array with one empty element inside of it, or one empty index. So I then did the dot map, and by doing dot map with element and index, I could essentially get back an index that counted, or an array that counted from 0 up to our request count. So let's say that we had instead a request count of 5. So if I put that in, it just gives me back an array of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So the entire purpose of that array.fill was to just give me a list of all the different indices that I need to request from the campaign. That's all. It's just a bit of clever JavaScript. All right, so that's definitely working the way I expect. So the last thing I want to do is to clean up this console log right here. So I'm going to delete the console log, and I'm going to make sure that I pass in that list of requests, or not pass in, but add it to this object that gets returned from getInitialProps right here. So now we can start to work with this list of requests inside of our component. Now the very last thing I want to do as well is make sure that I pass through the request count variable, because I might eventually want to print out the number of requests on my screen as well. So I'm going to make sure I pass in request count too. Okay, I think this looks good. Let's take a pause right here. We'll come back in the next video and we're going to start making use of this list of requests inside of our component. So quick break and I'll see you in just a minute. Now that we've got our list of requests available, we now need to somehow display them on the screen. So as a reminder, we definitely want to display all these as essentially a table, like so. As usual, we're not going to build the table out ourselves. Instead, we'll use Semantic UI React to see if there is not a table component that we can just make use of to get a nice looking table automatically created for us. I'm going to change back over to my Semantic UI documentation. I'll find the collections section, and then inside there I'll look for table. So here's the table documentation. We don't need a fancy table. We really just need the most bare bones plain table available. So here's the very first standard table available. And if I check out the code, we'll see a good example of how to put it together. So we need to import this table component from Semantic UI React, and then we're going to place like table.header, table.row, table.header_cell, table.body, and so on. So let's start to import table from Semantic UI, and I think we could at least get started by creating the header component inside of our requests index component. Let's do that right now. Back over at my code editor, I'll find my Semantic UI React import tag, and I'll make sure that I import table from that as well. Then down inside of my render method, here it is right here, I don't really feel like writing out table.header and table.row over and over and over again. So instead, I'm going to do a little bit of ES2015 destructuring. So I'll say const header, row, header cell, and body. So these are all properties that I'm going to pull off of my table tag. Now I can use all these to create the header inside of the actual JSX that we have right here. So underneath my link tag, I'm going to add on a table. And like I just said, all we really need right now is our header. So I'll place a header tag. Inside there, we'll place a row, And then we can start to create a couple of different header cells. Let's get a quick reminder of what all the different headers are that we need by looking at our mockup very quickly. So back over at my mockup, we want ID, description, amount, recipient, approval count, approve, and finalize. All right, so let's copy paste this thing down a couple times just so we don't have to retype header cell again and again. At the top, we can place ID, then description, amount, recipient, approval count, approve, and finalize. All right, so let's save this very quickly. We'll flip over to the browser and see how we're doing. So if I go back over to my browser, I should immediately see my table appear on the screen. And yeah, it definitely looks pretty reasonable at this point. So let's pause right here. We're going to come back in the next video and start to write out all the different rows that we need to represent for each request from our campaign. We've got the beginnings of our table put together inside the request index component. We now need to think about starting to get our list of requests rendered inside of here as well. Now I think that there's going to end up being a decent amount of logic tied to each row or each request inside of this component. So I'm thinking that rather than placing all the logic for rendering one individual row into our request index component, we should instead make a new component, something called like request row. And that thing will have a better idea of how to render one individual row, and it will also contain some helper methods for handling a user clicking on either the approve or finalize buttons. So we're going to make a separate component right now. The entire purpose of this component is going to be to render out one individual row. So let's start by making that new component inside of our components directory. Back inside my code editor, I'm going to find my components directory, and inside there I'll make a new file called requestrow.js. And then inside of here, I'll put together a little bit of dummy logic for a simple React component right now. At the top, we will import React and component. From React, I'll create a new component called requestRow, and then I'll define a render method that just returns a div for right now. And I'll just give it the text request, like so. Then at the bottom, we'll export default request row. Let's make sure that we now import this into our request index component, and then we'll iterate through our list of requests and render one of these for every request that we have. So back inside of our index.js file, I'll go back up to the top where we'll add an import statement for our request row component. We'll do .. components request row. Okay, that's looking good. So we've now got this component inside of here. Now we'll add a helper method to render one of these for every request that we've loaded up and fetched from our campaign. And we'll call that helper method from inside of our render method right here. So I'm going to make a helper method called render row. Inside of here, we will iterate over our list of requests, and for every request, we will return a new request row. All right, so I'm going to return this .props.request, or just requests. We'll map over that. We're going to pass an arrow function to this that gets called with every request and the index of each request as well. And then inside of here, we will return one new request row. The request row component right here is probably going to need a couple of different props so that it understands exactly what request it's trying to render on the screen. So I'm going to give this thing a couple different props. First off, I'm going to make sure I pass in the request that I want it to render. So that will be request, which is coming from this inner mapping function right here. I'm going to make sure that I also pass in a key property as well. And remember that a key property is a part of React. React wants us to always pass in a key whenever we are rendering a list of components. And then finally, I think that we probably will also need to pass in the address of the current campaign that we are working on as well. So we'll add in a prop of address, and I'll pass to it this.props.address, like so. Okay, I think that's good for right now. Now, the last thing I want to do is make sure that I call render row from inside of our render method. Now, render row is going to eventually form kind of like the backbone of the body of our table. So all the individual rows that you see right here. As a quick reminder, Semantic UI expects that we'll place all of our different rows inside of a body element. So I do need to make sure that I first place a table.body, and then we can call render rows from inside of that. And we just need to make sure that render rows eventually returns a table.row that contains a bunch of table.cells. But that's going to be some JSX that we return from our from our request row component. All right, so down inside of my render method, but still inside of my table. So notice how I'm inside of table right now. I'm going to place a body tag. So this body tag right here that I'm placing, you'll recall we destructured off of table just a moment ago. So here's the body tag right here. Then inside the body, we can call this dot render rows, like so. All right, so we might get an error message right now because we are trying to render a div inside of this body tag right here. But let's at least flip over to our browser and see if anything shows up at all. So back inside my browser, oh, okay, I think I might have mislabeled that function. I called render rows right here. And what did I actually call it when I render row? All right, my mistake, not render row right here. I want render rows. All right, so I'll save that and let's try again. All right, that's better. Okay, so it looks like maybe I get an error, maybe I don't. Yep, I definitely got an error message here because I'm trying to display a div inside of a table body. Like I said, we'll fix that up in just a moment, but at least for right now, I can verify that I'm displaying a request on the screen. And this request is supposed to represent one individual request coming from our campaign. So let's come back in the next video, and we're gonna kind of do a little bit of enhancement to our request row component and make sure that it displays on the screen a lot more like how our mock-up over here displays it. So quick pause, and we'll take care of that in the next video. Now that we've got one row rendering out for the single request we have, we can continue working on our request row component. Inside of request row, we're going to want to make sure that we pull a couple of different properties off of our individual request and attempt to show them on the actual table. Now remember here's the documentation for our table component. So each request row that we create has to return a table.row, and inside of it will be a couple of table.cells. So let's first get started inside of our request row component by importing Semantic UI, and we'll place these different components to represent the row and each individual cell. All right, so back over inside of request row, at the very top, I'm going to import table from Semantic UI React. Then down inside of my render method, I'm going to do the same thing I did before inside of our request index component, where we destructured only the actual components off of table that we cared about. So in this case, we probably only care about row and cell off of that table object. And then rather than returning a div from this thing, we can instead return a row, like so. Inside of the row component is going to be a collection of different cells, where each cell represents one different property of a request. Let's go review our mockup really quick, just to remember what every row is or what every cell we want to show. So the first one is going to be an ID. You will recall that we do not actually have anything called an ID tied to any one of our actual requests here. So this ID property, you might be wondering what this column for is exactly. Well, ID is supposed to be the index of an individual request inside of our request array. So really, we are taking its index inside that array as representing its ID. That's really the only unique identifying piece of information that we know that we'll always be guaranteed to have. At this point, however, we have not passed down the request index into this request row component. So if we go back over to our request index component and find the render rows function right here, I'm going to make sure that I take the index of each individual request out of the requests array, and I'm going to just make sure that I pass that down as an additional prop called ID, like so. So again, the index of request inside this array is going to represent its ID. So now back inside of request row, I can take my props object, I'm going to place a cell, and inside of it, inside of a set of curly braces, I'll reference this.props.id. And I'll save both these files, so both the index.js file and the requestrow.js file as well. And we'll test this out inside the browser. So back over at my application, I now see a cell here of 0 because the first request that we have will always have an index of 0. So this is definitely the correct ID in this case. Now that we've got the correct ID appearing, we'll move on to our next property, which is supposed to be the description of an individual request. For this, we need to access the request object that we pass down into this component through props. So back over inside of our render rows function, recall that we passed down the individual request as a prop called request. So now down inside of request row, we can place a new cell. Inside of it, we'll reference this.props.request.description, like so. And now if we save this file as well and flip back over to the browser, we should see our description appear. Very good. All right, I think that we've got a good pattern here going, and we definitely know at least how to get the next couple of cells on here as well. Now, before we start to fill in those additional cells, I want you to take notice of how we are going to be probably referencing this.props a couple of times inside this render method. So rather than writing out this.props very repetitively throughout this render method, I think we should do a little bit of destructuring here. So I'll say ID and request are going to come from this.props, like so. And now we can shorten these two expressions to be simply ID and request.description. Okay, that looks pretty good. Now let's get back to our table. So the next cell that we want to display on the screen is our amount. Now on the table, this column is labeled amount, but you will recall that as tied to an individual request, we are calling that property, or the amount of money that we want to send along with it, the value property. So when we place the next cell here, it's not going to be request.amount, it will be request.value. Remember that if at any point in time you forget the different properties that are tied to an individual struct, you can always go back to our campaign file, the campaign contract itself, and get a quick reminder of the different properties that are tied to a struct. So right now, if I open up my campaign.sol file, I can always look at my request right here, and you'll see that, yep, we call that thing value, not amount. All right, let's make sure that the value is showing up inside the browser as well. All right, now when I go back, you'll notice that it's a very large number here. So remember, whenever we store the value on a request, we are storing it in terms of way. We probably don't want to have way showing up on this table right here. Instead, we probably want to show it in terms of ether. So I think we should import our Web3 library and use that helper function on it to convert this into an ether value instead of way. So back inside of request row, I'll import Web3 from, and this is going to be our web3.js file right here. So it's going to be /Ethereum Web3. And then rather than just printing out request.value right here, we can say web3.utils.from way. We'll pass in request.value, and then as the second argument, we'll tell it that we want it to be printed out in terms of ether. And then don't forget the closing parenthesis right here as well. So now if we save this, we should see a much more reasonable 0.001 printed out on the screen. Cool, so that looks a lot better. All right, now there's just one more property I want to take care of, and then we're going to take a short break. So this is going to be the recipient property, which is going to be the address of the person we want to send this money to. So this one is going to be pretty straightforward. This is going to be, again, cell, and we'll do request.recipient, like so. And yep, there's our address. Okay, I think that we've gotten through a lot of content here. So let's take a quick pause, and then we're going to start finishing off these other columns in the next video. The next cell that we have to work on is our approval count cell. If we go back over to our mockups, you'll recall that there's actually two numbers displayed in the cell. The first one is supposed to be the number of approval votes tied to an individual request, and then the second number right here is supposed to be the total number of approvers who are tied to a campaign. So this is essentially telling us the fraction of people who have already approved a given request. Now getting the first number here to show up inside the cell will be easy enough. Remember, the approvers tied to a request is stored inside of our request struct. So if I go back over to my contract file inside of my contracts directory, we had stored the number of approvers on the given request object right here as a property called approval count. So we just need to take this property off of our request object and get it to display inside that cell. Then the total number of approvers who are tied to a campaign, like the overall number of approvers, is called the approvers count variable, and that is tied to the campaign itself. So we'll need to make sure that we also eventually fetch our approvers count value as well, and somehow get that to display inside of the cell 2. Let's first take care of our approvals that is tied to an individual request, because that's definitely the easier of the two. So back inside of my request row file, I'm going to add on an additional cell. Inside of that one, I'll print out request.approvers, what do we call that thing? Approval count, gee whiz. Approval count, there we go. So now if we go back over to our browser, we should be able to verify that this number displays on the screen. At present, I would expect it to be 0 because we have not yet approved any given request. And as a matter of fact, yep, it's definitely displaying as 0 right here. So next, we need to somehow fetch our total number of approvers tied to a campaign and then get that to show up inside this cell as well. So that's going to be a piece of information that is tied to a campaign contract, not an individual request. So the request itself has no idea how many people are actually marked as approvers inside of a campaign. That is only recorded inside the campaign contract. So you might be thinking that we need to again define a getInitialProps function inside of request row right here. But instead, rather than redefining that function and importing the campaign contract again and going through all those steps, I think we could just reuse the getInitialProps function that we've already defined inside of our request index component. So here's request index. We've already got access to our campaign right here. So I think we should just make an additional call to this thing and pull off the total number of approvers. So let's take that approach. Inside of this getInitialProps function, I'm going to define another variable called approvers count. We're going to get that from await campaign.methods.approversCount.call, like so. Now we can take this new value right here and add it to our object that eventually gets added to the props of our component. So to the object, I will add approvers count. Next, I need to make sure that I communicate this approvers count from this overall component down into our request row. So I'm going to add on an additional prop to request row. I'm going to call it approvers count, and it's going to get its value from this .props.approvers count. I'm going to save this file, and then the very last thing to do is to flip on over to request row and make sure we make use of this new prop. So here's request row. I'm going to destructure approvers count off of our props object, and I'll make use of it inside our cell down here. Now inside the cell, remember, we want a / to separate those two values. I'm going to make sure that I put that / outside of my curly braces, because if I put it inside, it will be interpreted as being like a division symbol, and it'll divide those two numbers, which is definitely not what we want. So outside of the curly braces, I'll place a /, I'll put another set of curly braces, and I'll place inside there approvers count. All right, so now last thing to do is save this file and then test this out inside the browser. And it looks like I have 3 reflected here because I have contributed to my campaign from 3 separate addresses. Now you might see on here simply a 1, something to say, hey, only 1 person has contributed to your campaign, which is totally fine. Also, if you don't see a number reflected here, I really encourage you to simply refresh the page as well. So if you refresh, you should see a 1 or 3 or 2 or whatever it is up here on the screen too. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. Now over time, as our users start to approve a given request, we should see the first number here start to increment. So I think the next thing we need to do is to define these buttons to approve and finalize a given request so we can increment this number of approvers value right here. So let's start to take care of that in the next video. The next thing that we have to do on our request row is to make sure that we have a button on here that a user can click to attempt to approve a given request. Let's first get started by adding a button that a user can click on, and then we'll worry about adding in some logic to run anytime a user actually clicks on it. Now I do want this to be an actual button, even though it's represented in this mockup right here as being a cell. So I want to make sure that I add in a button here from the Semantic UI library. I'm going to go back over to my request row component. At the top, I'll find my Semantic UI, and I'll add on a import for button as well. Then I'm going to add a new cell, and inside of it, I'll add on a new button tag. Now I'm going to give this button tag the text of approve, because whenever you click on it, you should be attempting to approve a given request. I'm going to give it a color of green rather than the previous primary that we used all over the place. I'm also going to give this another prop called basic. And I think you'll kind of like how this basic prop right here makes this button look. So let's save it right here and we'll get a good sense of what color green and basic do. So back over on my application, there we go. So it gives me this very nice looking green approve button. Of course, clicking on the button right now does absolutely nothing. So let's go back over to our component. We're going to add on a click event handler on this thing. Whenever a user clicks on this thing, we're going to want to make sure that we attempt to approve the request that this component is representing. So I'm going to add on a onClick prop, and whenever someone clicks on this thing, we're going to run a helper function that we're going to call this.onApprove. And remember, we're not going to place the parentheses here because we are not going to invoke this function right away. So now we're going to define onApprove. Inside there, we'll attempt to run some logic to approve a given request. So above my render method, I'm going to define onApprove. Now, much like a lot of the other event handlers that we've put together, this will be an asynchronous function because we're going to probably eventually have to reach out to our campaign and attempt to reference a given request and approve it in some fashion. As a quick reminder, let's flip over to our campaign file and get a quick refresher on exactly how we approve a request. So inside my contracts directory, I'll find my campaign file. I'm looking at the campaign contract, and if I scroll down a little bit, we can remember that we've got a function called approve request. So we need to call approve request, and we're going to pass in the ID or the index of the request that we want to approve. Remember that we don't have to actually specify the sender of this approval message or anything like that. The function itself is going to automatically read in the address of the person who is submitting this transaction. So all we have to do is call approve request with the index of the request. So that's not too bad. Now, you will recall, however, that we do have to get access to our campaign object or the campaign contract inside of here. So we will have to import our campaign helper function and create a new instance of our campaign. We could just pass down our campaign instance from our request index component over here, but hey, let's just get some practice on creating an actual campaign instance. No problem with that. So at the top, we'll start by importing campaign from Ethereum campaign. We'll then get a reference to our campaign by calling campaign and passing in the address of the campaign that we're currently working on. Now you will recall that we did already pass down that address into our request row. So I'm going to pass in this.props.address, like so. Then underneath this, we can immediately call await campaign.methods.approve request. We have to pass in the ID or the index of the request that this component is currently looking at, which is available on this.props.id. Remember, we used this props.id thing just a moment ago when we got the ID to log out inside of a cell. So we're going to call approve request. We'll pass our ID in, and we'll chain on a .send. Oops, one thing we forgot here was to get a list of all of our accounts. Let's make sure we do that right above. So we'll say const accounts is await web3.eth.get accounts. And then we can say this is from accounts at 0, like so. And we've already imported web3, so I think we're good in that regard as well. All right, so let's test this out inside the browser. So we should be able to start up the transaction, submit the transaction, and see our number of approvals, tied to a request increment by 1. All right, so back over here, I'm going to make sure that I do a hard refresh on this entire page. Now, one thing I want to remind you about is that you can only approve a request if you are marked as an approver on the campaign itself. So if you have not yet donated to the campaign that you are looking at, when you run this function right here, you're going to get an error. So do make sure that you have donated or contributed to the campaign that you're looking at right now. So I definitely have. So I think that I can go ahead and click on the approve button right here. I should see a MetaMask transaction appear. Now, if you see something down here that says like insufficient gas or something like that, then that means that MetaMask is thinking that when you run this function, the function will probably fail. And that probably means that you have not donated to this campaign yet. So if you see something on here about insufficient gas, again, please triple check to make sure that you have already donated to your campaign. So I'm now going to submit this transaction. And then as usual, we basically just wait. Now there's nothing really tied to our component just yet to reflect whether or not this is going to go through successfully. All we can do is kind of wait for a bit and then eventually expect to see this approval count right here be incremented by 1. So let's take a pause right here. We're going to come back in the next video where I'm going to refresh the page, and then I'm going to eventually expect to see approval account incremented by 1. So I'll see you in just a minute. In the last video, I attempted to approve a given request. I've now waited a couple seconds for that transaction to go through, and I'm now going to refresh the page. When I do so, I should expect to see my approval account right here increment by 1, and it definitely just did. So it looks like using the approve button right here worked just the way I expected. Now there's definitely some better signaling we could give to our users to let them know that, hey, that thing just went through and all that kind of good stuff. We'll take care of that additional polish in just a moment. But before we do, I want to make sure that I also implement this finalize button as well. So recall that whenever a request gets enough approvals, we should be eventually able to finalize the request. And that's what causes our money to actually be sent out to our recipient. So just like we did with the approve button right here, we're going to add another button, and whenever a user clicks on it, it will call a function on our contract to finalize the request. So I'm going to go back over to my code editor. I'm going to go down to my render method, and I'm going to add another cell inside of here. Inside this cell, we're going to place another button, just like before. And this one, we will give very similar props as well. I'm going to give it a color of teal. I'm going to mark it as basic, and then I'm going to give it the text of finalize. So let's save this and just check out that neat styling that we get from those two props. Okay, that looks pretty good right there. Let's set up an event handler on this thing as well. So I'm going to say on click, run a helper function that you and I are going to define right now called this.onFinalize, like so. Then we'll scroll up again and we're going to define this function. So up a little bit, I'll define onFinalize. This is again going to be an asynchronous arrow function. And basically the logic inside this thing is going to look just identical. So we're going to again create our campaign instance, we're going to get our list of accounts, and then we're going to call a function on our contract. but this time we're going to call a slightly different function. So when we were approving a request, we called approve request. But remember, whenever we want to finalize a request, here's my contract file really quickly, we're going to instead call the finalize request function. And we need to pass in the index of the request that we want to attempt to finalize. So I'm now going to go back over to my request row. I'm going to create my campaign instance. I will get my list of accounts. And then we'll call our function. So await campaign.methods.finalize request. We're going to pass in the ID of the request that we want to finalize, and then we'll send that in as a transaction coming from accounts at 0, like so. So now we'll save this file, and we'll test this out as well. So if I go back over to my browser, I'm going to do a hard refresh on this one. And then when it appears back, okay, very good, I'll now click on finalize. And now when I do, you're going to see that it says gas limit set dangerously high. Approving this transaction is likely to fail. So this is a little hint right here from MetaMask. And this hint is essentially telling us that it expects that if we send this transaction in, it thinks this thing is going to fail. In this case, it's absolutely correct because we do not yet have enough approvals tied to this request to actually get it approved. I still have to get at least 2 out of 3 approvals in order to finalize this request right here. So this is a very interesting feature of MetaMask that we have not yet discussed. Whenever we attempt to send a transaction to a function, MetaMask is going to attempt to simulate running that function ahead of time. So when we click on finalize right here and attempt to invoke that function on our contract, MetaMask simulates running that function for us. When it does that simulation, it can then tell whether or not something inside there is likely to fail. In this case, it's definitely going to fail. So MetaMask shows us this little error message on the screen right here. This is a very important note because when you start working on your own projects, if you start to run functions that will fail, you're going to get this error message right here. And it's very easy to look at this error message and think, oh, there's something wrong with my gas value. Well, no, that's not it at all. Your gas value is totally fine. What's the problem is your function itself is going to fail, and it's not tied to the gas at all. So in this case, I'm going to reject this function, and I clearly need to get an appropriate number of approvals on this thing before I attempt to actually finalize it. So I'm going to take a pause. I'm going to make a new request that we can work with, and we'll continue in the next video and attempt to actually finalize a legitimate request that is ready to be finalized. So quick break, and I'll hook back up with you in just a moment. In between the last video and this one, I created an entirely new campaign and assigned 1 request to it. I did that just so I could get my total number of approvers down to 1. This is kind of the part where testing this stuff starts to become a little bit of a pain because you have to set up these campaigns and these requests and get them into the state where you can actually attempt to test your code. As you might imagine, this is where starting to have really solid test coverage around your contracts, it starts to get really handy. Now I've marked this request right here as having a recipient as my second account in MetaMask. So if I now open up MetaMask and flip on over to my second account, you'll notice that it has 0.007 Ether. I'm now going to go back over to account 1, and I'm going to attempt to finalize this request. So I'm going to submit it, and then I'm going to wait for a little bit. So after about 15 or 20 seconds, however long it takes, I should eventually be able to flip back over to my second account and verify that it has received an additional 0.001 Ether. So I'm going to kind of prep for that by opening up MetaMask. I'm going to go on over to account number 2, and we're going to have to kind of just wait for a second for this thing to actually update. Now, while I'm waiting for that, there are a couple things I want to mention about this table right here. As it stands right now, we have finalized this request. However, nothing on this table seems to actually indicate that that is the case. Also, this thing has enough approvals to be finalized, but again, there's really no visual element here to tell our users that this thing is ready to be finalized. So even though we might have all the functionality of our table put together, I think that we could still do a little bit of polish here, like some visual indicators to let our users know that a request has been finalized, or let them know that it is ready to be finalized. All right, so let's check out my balance now. If I open up MetaMask back up on account number 2, you'll notice that I'm now up to 0.008 Ether. So that's pretty much it. That definitely is working out the way we expect. I'm definitely able to finalize a request. However, there's still, like I just mentioned, a couple of usability issues here. So let's come back in the next video, and we're going to add a couple of styling rules to this thing to make sure that we make it more obvious to our users when something is ready to be approved or finalized or whatever else. So quick break, and I'm going to join back up with you in the next video. Our approve and finalize functionality is working out pretty well, but the status of each of these requests is still really unclear to our users. In this video, we're going to add some additional CSS styling to give our users a little bit more of a hint of what requests are ready to go. Now notice that I've added 2 additional requests here. The first request, or the request with ID of 1, I should say, has enough approvals, but it has not yet been finalized. The request with ID of 2 does not have enough approvals, so it's not ready to finalize, and it hasn't been finalized for that matter. So I'm going to say that if a request has been finalized, I want to hide its buttons. We had just finalized the first row, or this ID of 0 right here, so I think that these 2 buttons right here should probably be hidden from our users. And we'll also say that if a request is ready to be finalized, then we should mark the entire row with like green or like highlight it or something like that. I think those 2 changes, both hiding buttons and marking a row with some highlight, will make the status of our requests a lot more obvious. So let's flip over to our code editor and start adding those 2 additional improvements. All right, so I think the first thing we'll do is make sure that we appropriately mark a request as complete or finalized by hiding the buttons. So I'm going to go down to my 2 buttons down here, and we're going to add some additional logic around these. So what we're going to do is going to be a little bit of, just a little bit of typing, but just bear with me for a second. So right above the first button here, I'm going to add 1 opening curly brace. And then under the button, I'm going to add 1 additional closing curly brace as well. Then inside the top curly brace, we're going to add a ternary expression. So we're going to look at request.complete. Remember that the .complete property right here is a Boolean that is specified on our request struct that tells us whether or not a given request has already been finalized. So if complete is true, then we want to hide this button. So to do so, I'm going to add on request.complete, a space, a question mark, another space, null, and then a colon. And after the colon, we're going to add a set of parentheses that wrap our button component, like so. All right, so a little bit of reformatting here, and there it is. All right, so let's look at this little segment here in total. So we're saying that if request.complete is true, then return the value null from this entire expression. When we return null, we will not show this button anymore. However, if request.complete is false, then we will instead render the entire button right here. So let's save this file and see what this does for the first request in my list. So now back over here, that approve button is hidden because this thing has already been completed. Now we can repeat that same process for the other button as well. So I'm going to place a set of curly braces like so. I'm going to indent my button. I'll reference request.complete, question mark null, and then wrap that button tag in a set of parentheses. And I'll save this as well. Okay, so now the finalize button is hidden here too. So now it's a lot more obvious that, hey, you can't interact with this thing anymore. It's already been finalized. Now I think that another kind of little improvement to this row right here that would be really nice is if we just kind of like grayed out the entire row. That would make it really, really obvious that this request has already been finalized. So for that, we're going to make use of a little prop that we can pass to our row component right here. So this is a property that is tied to semantic UI. So I'm going to add on disabled. And if we want this thing to be disabled, we're going to pass in request.complete as well. So whenever this thing is complete, disabled will be true. So let's save this and see what that does. Okay, now that's looking pretty good right there. Now it is abundantly obvious that this request right here is entirely complete, no more interacting with it. Now I think maybe the last thing we need to do is somehow indicate that my request with ID 1 right here is ready to be finalized. So back inside my render component, I'm going to add an additional flag up the top here. And this flag is going to indicate whether or not our row is, or our request is ready to be finalized. So I'm going to make a new variable called ready to finalize. And this thing is going to look at our total number of approvers tied to our, or the total number of approvals tied to our request. So that will be request.approval count. And we're going to check to see if this thing is greater than approvers count divided by 2, like so. So we're going to have this ready to finalize flag. I'm going to then add one additional prop to my row component. I'm going to say positive equals ready to finalize, like so. So this is another prop that is tied to my row component, another prop tied to semantic UI. If we pass in true for positive right here, it'll kind of like highlight our row. So let's save this thing and see what this does. So now when we go back over, very good. So now you'll notice that this row right here is marked as green, meaning this thing is ready to be approved. However, now the row that we've already kind of finalized right here is green as well. And we probably don't want that to be green. So we should probably add in some little expression to positive right here. So I'm going to say if this thing is ready to finalize and it has not yet been request.complete. So if it's ready to finalize and it's not been marked as complete, then we want this thing to be marked as green. So I'm going to save this as well. Now if we go back over, there we go. Okay, so just very small improvements here, or very small changes, but it has dramatically increased the ability for our users to take a glance at this table and understand the status of each of these requests. So this is looking pretty good. All right, I think there's just one last little small thing that I want to do. You'll recall that if we look back at our mockup, we had wanted to put down at the bottom left, found one request here. So let's take care of this last little piece in the next video, and I think we'll be all set with our request index component. The last thing that I want to do on our request index component is get our button to move off to the right-hand side, as we had shown in the mocks. And I also want to print out the total number of requests down here at the bottom of the screen. So these are both going to be very small changes, so let's get to it right now. Back inside my code editor, I'm going to find my requests index.js file. So here's request index right here. I'll then go down to my render method. So here's the render method. I'm going to find my link tag, and on the button tag itself, I'm going to add some additional styling or some additional props. First off, I'm going to pass on a floated right property. And if we save this, we should see the button pop off to the right-hand side, like that. However, now the button is really mashed up against the table. So I'm going to also pass this thing some additional margin for the bottom so that it gets a little bit of standoff as well. So back on my button, I'll manually add on a style tag with margin bottom of 10. And do remember here that we place two sets of curly braces, one for the JSX and one to indicate a object. So now if we save this, we get a little bit of standoff right here, which looks a lot better. Okay, now the other thing that we need to take care of is getting the total number of requests to print down at the bottom left-hand side. This is going to be really straightforward. We've already got our prop of request count added to our props object from getInitialProps up here at the top. So back down inside of my render method, underneath my table, I'm going to add on a div, and I'll give it the text found this.props.requests count requests, like so. So now we could go and check this out inside the browser, and oops, looks like I probably made a typo there. So I said request count right here. Let's go check up on the render method one more time. Oh, request count, my mistake, singular. So this should be simply request count. And I think that's the second time I made that mistake. Was not very consistent there. All right, so that looks a lot better. Okay, so I think that's pretty much it for this request index page. Now I think maybe there's one or two more things that we need to address inside of our application. So let's continue in the next video, and I'm going to mention a couple other things that we might want to add in. All right, my friends, in the last video, we finished up our request index component, and our application is pretty much at completion at this point. We now have the ability to create campaigns. We can view individual campaigns and get some details about them. Let's go out to the normal size here. Our users can create requests, they can view requests, and eventually disperse money tied to an individual campaign. And of course, once the requests are created, our users can easily see the status of each of these requests as well. So that's pretty much it on the Ethereum side of our application. There's still a couple of other topics that we can discuss, but that's pretty much it, like I said, for the Ethereum side. So I hope you've enjoyed this application and learned quite a bit around it.